welcome everyone on behalf of the Kirby Laing Centre and Lawyers Christian Fellowship. So this is an event that we are co-hosting together, and I'm very grateful to Mark Bainbridge, who's with us. He's the director of Lawyers Christian Fellowship in the UK, and for all their help in promoting and organizing this event. So I am Craig Bartholomew, and I'm the director of the Kirby Laing Centre for Public Theology in Cambridge. But it's wonderful to see you all today and to have people joining us for this very important discussion from all over the UK and all over the world. So please feel very, very welcome. I wish we were all face to face, but that would be quite an expensive event, you understand. But and even within Africa, we're very well represented. So Naomi is in Kenya, so we even have Kenya represented, which is wonderful. So the topic for today is the battle for the soul of Southern Africa, an interview with Senator David Coltart. And Senator Coltart is a human rights lawyer. He also served in the unity government under Mugabe, and he ended up on the Senate and as Minister of Education, of Sport and Arts and Culture. So in the course of the interview, you'll learn a lot more about him. I should just hold up his blockbuster of a book at the outset. The Struggle Continues, 50 Years of Tyranny in Zimbabwe. And this is a big fat book, but it's so readable and so important. And I would encourage all of us to get a copy and also to alert other people to it. In my opinion, it's an extraordinarily important book. And so we're very privileged to have David with us. I should also tell you that David is a senior research fellow of the Kirby Laing Centre for Public Theology in Cambridge. And so we are very honored to have him associated with us in that way. The Kirby Laing Centre is part of the Cambridge Theological Federation, which is a consortium of 14 different institutions in Cambridge that are also deeply linked into the university. Now, the way we're going to proceed today is the first hour will be an interview in which I will ask David questions, and then he will respond, and so on and so forth. And then after the first hour, we will have a break, a 5 or 10 minute break, depending on how we're doing, for coffee. And then we'll reconvene for Q&A. And can I just make 2 comments about how Q&A will work? You can, during the course of the interview or the break, you can submit any questions you might have into the chat. And Dave and I will be monitoring those. David Beltman and I will be monitoring those, and then we'll collate them in some form or another for the Q&A. And then just to let you know, this is a public event. So of course it's open to everyone, and everyone is welcome. And also to let you know that any question can be asked. But the one thing we do practice at the Kirby Laing Centre is civil discourse. So we don't mind how controversial the questions are, but as long as the question is asked in a civil fashion and we respond civilly. So that's the ethos in which we operate, and we ask you to respect that. Now, if Dave hasn't done it already, can I ask you to mute yourself, please? And only to unmute if you are asking a question or if your name is David Coltart. Okay. So please don't unmute, because it creates all sorts of problems. Now, the Kirby Laing Centre for Public Theology, we open dialogue with anyone who wants to speak to us. So we have very broad engagements, but we are a Christian organization. And as I reflect as a South African, I was born and grew up in South Africa, so that's where the accent comes from. As I reflect on South Africa, on Zimbabwe, on what is going on in Europe at the moment, the challenges in America, the challenges that my friends are facing in countries like the Philippines, I do confess that I find it almost overwhelming. And one thing that it reminds me is that us humans are not adequate to solve all these problems. We need God's help. And so what I did, just as a way of getting us going, is to ask for a moment of silence. And then I've crafted a prayer, which is a combination of the South African anthem, Nkosi Sikelel' Afrika, and the Zimbabwean national anthem. So just to be right out in the open, that's where this prayer comes from. So can I ask us to have a moment of silence, and then I will get David in for the interview. Nkosi Sikelel' Afrika. God bless Africa. May her glory be lifted high. Hear our petitions. Lord, bless us, your children. O lovely Zimbabwe, so wondrously adorned with mountains and rivers, cascading, flowing free. May rain abound and fertile fields. May we be fed, our labor blessed. And may the Almighty protect and bless our land. Lord, we ask you to protect our nations, intervene and end all conflicts. Protect us, protect our nations, protect South Africa, Zimbabwe, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, America, Europe, and the many other nations of Africa and the world. Amen. Okay, so Dave, if you can spotlight David Coltart and myself now, then David, I must just tell you what a privilege it is to have you with us, you know? So thank you so much for making the time for this event, and so welcome.
Good evening, Craig, and good evening or good morning to some of you, everyone. It's a great blessing and privilege for me to be able to join you today, and I'm looking forward to this.
Good. Okay. So, David, there's so much I could have said about you in the introduction, but I think a lot of it will come out in the course of our questions. So I hope that's okay. So the first question, as you know, is as follows. As we see in what I regard as your extraordinarily important book, The Struggle Continues, you have lived with your family through tumultuous times in Southern Africa and in Zimbabwe in particular, and you've been creatively involved in many important and challenging areas. But to start with, could you tell us what you do now and what you are involved with politically now?
Well, I mean, most importantly, I'm involved in my church. I'm an elder in our church, and I have a lovely wife and 4 children, and we've just had our 7th grandchild on Tuesday. So that's, that keeps a lot of my time, and I feel incredibly blessed through that. But my day job is primarily as a lawyer. I've been a lawyer in Zimbabwe since 1983, and I've been senior partner of one of Zimbabwe's oldest law firms, set up in 1897 when the railways came to Zimbabwe, and I remain senior partner of that law firm. I thought that I had retired from politics. And then in 2019, in the run-up to the NDC Alliance Congress, Jenny, my wife, and I were on holiday in South Africa, and we suddenly received a variety of messages indicating that I'd been nominated by different provinces for treasurer. And so we decided to put a fleece out. It certainly wasn't my intention to go back into politics in that way. But to cut a long story short, I was elected at the Congress in Gweru in May 2019. And so I stress, for my sins, which are many, I'm now treasurer of what was the MDC Alliance, and due to all the machinations in this country, has now changed. We've started a completely new party in February this year, which is now called the Citizens Coalition for Change, or Triple C, under the leadership of Nelson Chamisa. So I'm a lawyer, I'm a Treasurer General of the Triple C, and I have my family and other commitments. And I do a variety of other things. I started a Christian school with others and in Bulawayo, and have been heavily involved in that up until late last year.
Okay. And so, David, I expect it's your son, Winston, who's just had the latest grandchild. Is that right?
That's right. Winston, Ezra Coltart.
Ezra Coltart. Okay. Well, that's a wonderful name. And you know, just David, when I've talked to you, so treasurer sounds to us like you just look after the money, but I gather it's a lot more than that. Am I right?
It's a lot more than that. It involves a fundraising component. I was also responsible for setting up the website for the party in 2020. And I need to explain some of the context for everyone today. Zimbabwe is not a democracy, it's a tyranny. Mr. Mnangagwa is a mini Putin. We don't have access to nuclear weapons. We don't have an economy as big as Russia, but Mnangagwa demonstrates all the same characteristics as Mr. Putin. And so in the last couple of years, he has made it his job, along with his party, to completely crush the opposition. And that has included trying to cut off all legitimate sources of money for us to fund the political party, which of course directly impacts me. And so we've had members of parliament illegally removed from parliament. And of course, with that comes the support that they give. We've had the funding that was meant to be directed towards us in terms of the votes we gained in the last election have been cut off. Our headquarter building has been taken over by the military, including my office and computers. And so you'll see that this is no ordinary job as a treasurer. It has unique challenges where one is up against a regime which is determined to literally throttle us, to cut us off. And of course, a key way of doing that is by ensuring that all legitimate sources of funding are cut off.
Wow, okay. And David, can you just remind us of the name CCC? And is that a website we can easily access?
So the history of opposition politics in Zimbabwe over the last couple of decades is that in 1999, an amalgam of churches and human rights organizations and trade unions formed a political party called the Movement for Democratic Change. And that party existed literally up until January this year. I don't have the time to go into all the detail, and I don't want to bore the audience, but suffice it to say that party was infiltrated, and some of those who'd been infiltrated on behalf of the regime announced in January that they were going to use our name, the NDC Alliance, in the run-up to by-elections, which were held in March. And we took the decision that the only way we could give clarity to the electorate was by dissolving the MDC and setting up an entirely new party called the Citizens Coalition for Change, CCC. Unfortunately, it does not have a website yet. We are working on that. We had to shut down everything we had established. So there's no website at present, but as soon as it is up, I will let you know.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's so. Thank you for that update.
There is a Facebook page.
There is indeed.
Okay. Thank you, David, for the update. So I encourage us all to. I really do encourage us all to purchase, read, and share David's book. So it's one way to get in touch with the history of Zimbabwe as well as David's own history. So David, for those of us, so I'm not asking you to repeat the whole narrative because we can buy this wonderful book and read it. But for those of us unfamiliar with the story, could you just review a bit of the history and focusing in particular on your work in the 1980s and documenting the horrendous genocide in Matabele land, and then later your role as Minister of Education, Sports and Arts and Culture in the Unity Government?
The book itself spans some 60 years. I turned 65 this year, so it is a history of the last 60 years, but it's a political autobiography. It starts in the period around my birth, which was a critically important historical period in Zimbabwe's history, because Garfield Todd, who had been Prime Minister of Southern Rhodesia, lost office a few months after I was born. And it was a critical moment because the Southern Rhodesia then was on a more democratic path. That was changed. Ian Smith came to power in the aftermath of Garfield Todd's political demise. And as I'm sure all of us know, in 1965, Ian Smith and his Rhodesia Front Party declared independence unilaterally from Britain. And that tragically set in train a very bloody civil war between black nationalist forces and the white minority government in the 1970s. I was, of course, a young person during that period, but all white people were conscripted, and I, like virtually all my contemporaries, was conscripted and went into the police for 2.5 years into the midst of this very brutal war, which still informs my attitudes today regarding nonviolence. I studied, I survived the war and went to study at the University of Cape Town between 1978 and the end of 1982. And then my wife and I felt called back. I became a Christian in 1981 at the University of Cape Town. And my wife and I felt called to come back to Zimbabwe. And we both came back in 1982. And I started legal practice on the 2nd of January, 1983. And within 3 weeks of me starting legal practice, Robert Mugabe deployed his North Korean trained 5th Brigade, a specially trained brigade, a political brigade, into the areas surrounding where I lived, Bulawayo. And the purpose of this brigade was political. It was designed primarily to destroy what was then the leading opposition party, ZAPU, which then was under the leadership of Joshua Nkomo. If you know anything of Zimbabwean Zimbabwe's history, you will know that there are two principal Black nationalists, the Colossus, who dominated the politics of Zimbabwe in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, namely Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo. And going back to the war, Joshua Nkomo's party, ZAPU, waged guerrilla war against the white minority government from Zambia, backed by the Russians, and Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF party waged war from the east, from Mozambique, backed by the Chinese. And so Zimbabwe found itself after independence, which happened in 1980, in the midst of this not only internal domestic strife, but right in the vortex of the Cold War and a battle between the West, the Soviet Union, and the Chinese. Mugabe had always indicated his desire to establish a one-party state, being a Marxist himself, and Joshua Nkomo and his ZAPU party stood in the way of that particular goal. On the sidelines earlier, going back to 1980, on the sidelines of Tito's funeral in April 1980, Mugabe met Kim Il-sung from North Korea and began then plotting the destruction of Joshua Nkomo and his ZAPU party. And it was then that they started training this, or rather, it was then that they agreed to train up this new brigade, which was trained in terror tactics. Anyway, to bring us back to 1983, on the 20th of January 1983, the 5th Brigade was deployed into Matabeleland, and it works systematically to decimate what I would term the second and third tier structures of ZAPU. Crimes against humanity were committed. Many would argue that it was also a genocide, in that primarily Shona-speaking members of the 5th Brigade targeted Ndebele-speaking members of ZAPU. It's another debate whether it was a genocide. What is very clear is that war crimes were committed because civilians were killed extrajudicially. And between January 1983 and the time when peace finally came in late 1987, in excess of 20,000 people were brutally murdered by the 5th Brigade and other arms of the Zimbabwe government. As a young lawyer, I was drawn into that to defend people who had been detained and tortured. I represented family members to try and locate people who had been disappeared. In 1984, there was the equivalent of a concentration camp set up south of the city where I live, called Balagwi, and many people disappeared during that period. At the same time, Mugabe and his ZANU-PF party employed a tactic to try and undermine Joshua Nkomo's senior leadership through the spurious arrest and prosecution of his senior leadership. And I was drawn in as defense counsel to represent many of these senior leaders, including Joshua Nkomo's brother Stephen, and other luminaries like Sidney Malunga and others who were part of the ZAPU's senior leadership. As I say, that episode culminated in 1987 with the signing of a unity accord, which in fact simply achieved Mugabe's goal of a one-party state. ZANU-PF swallowed ZAPU, and ZAPU no longer existed. Joshua Nkomo became deputy president, and a relative peace was restored to the country. But of course, the critical thing was that Mugabe had achieved the establishment of a de facto, if not de jure, one-party state. And that situation persisted from 1987 through to 1999, when the MDC, the Movement for Democratic Change, was established and posed the first real threat to ZANU-PF's hegemony since ZAPU had been swallowed up by ZANU-PF. And in the 2000 general election, we came very close to defeating ZANU-PF. In fact, we did defeat ZANU-PF, but because of the rigged nature of the election and widespread violence, ZANU-PF narrowly won that election. Since then, of course, there has been terrible political strife in the country, accompanied by hyperinflation. And the combination of that strife and hyperinflation led to the MDC winning the election in 2008, Mugabe not accepting that election and further acts of violence, which in turn led to the African Union and the Southern African Development Community compelling Mugabe to enter into a government of national unity, which started in February 2009. And it was in that context, as a member of the MDC, I was drawn into the government of national unity as Minister of Education. You can imagine, after almost a decade of political turmoil and the second highest rate of inflation the world has ever seen, the education sector was in complete turmoil. And it was my job to try and stabilize the sector. I was involved in that role from February 2009 to August 2013. And during that period, we managed to stabilize the country generally, stabilize the economy, but also managed to stabilize the education sector. I declared an amnesty. Many teachers had left the service, and we got 15,000 teachers back. We got all over 8,000 schools functioning. On the day I took office, none of them were functioning. They were all closed. And we got the textbook pupil ratio down from 15 to 1, that is 15 pupils to 1 textbook in February 2009, to 1 to 1 by 2011. We achieved quite a bit in the education sector, but in 2013, ZANU-PF once again used its position to manipulate the elections, and all of us in the MDC lost our positions in cabinet. And since then, ZANU-PF has taken full control. I'll close at that point because those were the specific questions I think you wanted.
Yeah, thank you, David. A harrowing and extraordinary narrative. So just a follow-up question. I know that an organization you established with a Catholic organization documented the so-called genocide. Now, that has been published. I have my copy in South Africa, and it is, yeah, you've got your copy there. Okay. So, okay, Breaking the Silence, Building True Peace. Okay. So mine is a different edition, but, you know, what is so extraordinary, I mean, I just find it horrendous reading, because it goes from village to village, documenting, you know, the deaths, the rapes, and whatever else happened. But has, you know, my hunch is, but tell me if I'm wrong, at the time the genocide was taking place, Mugabe was being given awards in the United Kingdom and so on, was he not?
Indeed, he was. Not so much at the time the genocide took place. He was knighted in 1994.
So after the genocide?
After the genocide. allow me just briefly to speak about this. So one of the things that I did on coming back to Zimbabwe was to set up an organization called the Bulawayo Legal Project Centre, which in turn became part of a wider organization called the Legal Resources Foundation. I don't know if you can see that at the bottom there. And after peace was secured in 1987, it was very clear to me and many of my colleagues in the church and in the legal fraternity and elsewhere that the politicians had been sorted out, but the real victims of the crimes against humanity, poor villagers mainly, had been forgotten about. On top of that, it was clear that the new unity government was determined to literally bury the past and ignore what had happened. With many people, many of these poor people, continuing to battle without birth certificates, without breadwinners, wives lost their husbands, children lost their parents. And so we decided, in conjunction with the Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace, you can probably see that there, we decided in the early 1990s that we would document what had happened. And so we embarked on a program starting in 1990, going village by village in certain areas. And it culminated in the publication of this report in 1997. The report was endorsed by the Catholic bishops and by the Legal Resources Foundation, which of course was a secular organization, and presented to Mugabe. Now, in fairness to the British government, this report only came out in 1997 after Mugabe had been given a knighthood. But of course, intelligence reports show that the British and indeed many Western governments were fully aware of the extent of the brutality. Tragically, they looked the other way in the interests of the Cold War. They were focused on trying to do what they could to end apartheid and, of course, to fight the Cold War. And quite frankly, they knew that Mugabe was supported by the Chinese, Nkomo was supported by the Soviet Union, and their greater enemy then was the Soviet Union rather than China. And because of those factors of trying to portray Zimbabwe in the best possible light for South Africa, to try and convince white South Africans that there would be life after apartheid, and because of their anxiety to keep the Soviet Union's influence in Southern Africa at bay, they conveniently ignored the intelligence that they had. And as you correctly point out, go indeed the extra step of giving Mugabe a knighthood. And indeed, many British and American universities gave him honorary degrees, including Edinburgh University, which was all a travesty.
David, there is a name in Zimbabwe for this genocide. Can you tell us what the name is and what it means?
Well, the name is a Shona name called Gukuruhundi. Gukuruhundi. It's a Shona word that describes the first rains that come after our long, dry winters and sweep away the chaff and the dust. It's somewhat of a paradox because its original meaning is actually quite good, because it is meant to be a cleansing in a positive way. And the First Brigade described themselves and what they were doing as the Gukuruhundi. But of course, it's now come to have this dreadful meaning, a meaning of terror, crimes against humanity, of not cleaning things up, but cleaning away people, wiping out.
Ethnic cleansing. David, just before we move on, so I know Mugabe's knighthood was revoked, but have the honorary doctorates and all these things, have they been revoked?
I think that many of the doctorates were revoked. I think that some were not, but many were. I think, in particular, the University of Edinburgh did revoke its award.
Yeah, and David, just before we move on, so on a lighter note, the chair of our trustees is a fanatic cricketer, and I have a wonderful book by a Christian Zimbabwean cricketer who I think refers to you. I forget his name. Yes. Now, were you also Minister of Sport, and did you get to go to all these international cricketing events?
Well, that was the fun side of the job. I was Minister of Sport as well as Minister of Education, and in Zimbabwe we have an expression, I don't know whether you use it in Britain, of landing with your bum in the butter. And I certainly did, because I was able to go to the 2010 World Cup football in Johannesburg, the 2011 Cricket World Cup in India, and in 2012 I led the Zimbabwe delegation to the London Olympics. So
oh my goodness.
I was thoroughly spoilt during that period. But it also fed, I am a cricket fanatic, and I, during that period, was able to watch a lot of cricket, which was fun.
Yeah, okay. All right. Now, we know that Robert Mugabe was ousted as president, but, and you've already spoken a bit to this, but how are things going in Zimbabwe under the new president?
Craig, in answering this, I need to take you back to breaking the silence and to Gokorohundi, because Robert Mugabe has historically been blamed almost solely for what happened in 1983. And there's no doubt that he bears the primary responsibility, because he was then Prime Minister of the country. However, the Gokorohundi policy rested on the actions, was executed by three men. Three men were involved. I need to take you slightly back in history to the period 1980 through to 1983, because during that period, the offices of ZAPU were raided by our secret police, which is called the Central Intelligence Organization. At that time, the Central Intelligence Organization was answerable to the Minister of State Security, who was Emmerson Mnangagwa, the current president. And when they raided these offices, they got lists of all the office bearers of ZAPU. And so when the 5th Brigade started its genocide, started committing crimes against humanity, every stick of the 5th Brigade, every unit that is, that arrived at a village where there was a ZAPU leader, would have a member of the Central Intelligence Organization with them, with these lists, indicating that this person was chairman of this district or secretary or treasurer, and those were the people identified for summary execution. And so Mr. Mnangagwa was heavily involved in that. Secondly, the commander of the 5th Brigade was a man called Perence Shiri, a particularly brutal man. And he, of course, was responsible for the deployment and the conduct of the 5th Brigade. He, up until recently, has been the Minister of Agriculture in Mr. Mnangagwa's government. And then finally, and critically, the 5th Brigade, being a political brigade, didn't have all the support services that a normal army brigade will have, because it was a new brigade, and so it didn't have barracks and didn't have paymasters and vehicles and the like. And so they were heavily reliant on one of the historical brigades, one of the regular brigades of the Zimbabwean army, namely one brigade, which was based in Bulawayo in 1983. One brigade at that time was headed by a man called Dominic Chinenge, who has subsequently changed his name to Augustine Chiwenga, the current deputy president in Mr. Mnangagwa's government. I say this to illustrate that when Mr. Mugabe was deposed in the coup of November 2017, he was deposed by people who had, in fact, more blood on their hands than Mr. Mugabe himself. Mugabe never directly got involved in Gukurahundi. There's no doubt that he directed the policy from Harare, but these three men who I've just mentioned were intimately involved, physically involved in the areas where these atrocities took place. And so when they took over from Mugabe, when they deposed Mugabe in November 2017, many of us who knew that history were deeply concerned. Tragically, let it be said that the British government, through the British ambassador at the time, backed Mnangagwa and was optimistic about his ability to settle the country. I reiterate, many of us who knew the history immediately expressed our reservations. I wrote an op-ed in January 2018 saying that Mr. Mnangagwa could have turned over a new leaf, that he had the opportunity to be either a Gorbachev or a Milosevic. Tragically, since he has taken over, he has shown himself to be a Milosevic. And this may surprise people listening tonight, but Mr. Mnangagwa is in fact far worse than Mr. Mugabe. Tragically, many people in the international community thought that he was going to take Zimbabwe on a new democratic path, but by every possible indicator, he is worse. We have had dreadful human rights abuses take place in August 2018 and January 2019, where troops were deployed onto the streets of Harare primarily, and civilians were murdered in cold blood. As I explained at the beginning of this interview, in the last two years, we've seen the systematic, an attempt to systematically decimate the opposition in Zimbabwe in ways that Robert Mugabe never did during his tenure. On top of all of this, the government under Mr. Mnangagwa has in fact become far more corrupt than anything under Robert Mugabe, with obscene accumulation of wealth under the senior elite of Mr. Mnangagwa's office. Tragically, the consequences of this have been to collapse the economy again. And once again, we have the highest level of inflation in the world in Zimbabwe, with the Zimbabwe dollar, as I speak today, just rapidly declining in value. And tragically, to go back to my old portfolio, sectors of society like education facing total collapse.
Okay, thank you, David. So just moving on. So I want to take two questions together just because of our time limits. But, I mean, what is so intriguing to me is the way in which the challenges of Southern Africa are more clearly now the challenges of the West and of the world. So I've often felt that in Zimbabwe or South Africa, you see writ large match what countries in the West and in Europe are struggling with. So, do you think there is a battle for the soul of Southern Africa underway between authoritarian leaders and sorry, just those of you who are listening, if you're not muted, can I ask you to mute? Because we are getting some funny feedback. So, in Southern Africa, would you say that there is a battle between authoritarian, corrupt leaders and Democrats? And then my crude question, as I put it to you, but we have to ask this because, we hardly take any notice of what's going on in Zimbabwe. But why does this matter to the West? Why should it matter to the West?
Okay, well, to answer your first question, there is a battle for the soul of Southern Africa going on. To put it more positively, if one looks back 30 years, one can say that there's been considerable progress in Southern Africa, and that apartheid has ended. Nelson Mandela came to power. And of course, in Rhodesia, our own version of apartheid was ended. White minority rule ended 42 years ago, and that was a positive. Took both Rhodesia and South Africa on a more democratic route. And the same happened earlier on in Mozambique and then subsequently in Namibia, with black majority rule governments coming to power. However, since particularly the loss of power, or rather the retirement of Nelson Mandela, we have seen democracy going backwards in Southern Africa. We've seen, for example, in South Africa itself, with Zuma and the allegations of corruption, the attacks on the judiciary, attacks on respect for the rule of law in South Africa being under enormous threat, along with corrupt practices flourishing in South Africa. And the same has happened in Zambia, in Mozambique, and Malawi, to a less extent in Botswana, to a less extent in Namibia. But for example, if we look at Zambia, Zambia at one point was a country of great hope, where Kenneth Kaunda was removed peacefully. But we then saw a succession of governments culminating in President Lunga of Zambia, who thankfully was voted out of office last year, taking Zambia down a very authoritarian path. And so we've seen this battle emerge within Southern Africa, when many of the gains brought about by Nelson Mandela's release and the transition to democracy in South Africa being undermined, not only in South Africa, but throughout the region. And Zimbabwe, because of, and let me lead in then to the second half of your question. Zimbabwe, because of its geographical position, because of its transport links, because of its history, because of the status of a man like Robert Mugabe, because of the high levels of education, the high literacy rates of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has had disproportionate influence on Southern Africa, both negatively and positively. And it is a corrosive factor in Southern Africa. And we are now very much at a crossroads, particularly in the last few years. In South Africa, we've seen South Africa start to inch back towards Nelson Mandela's vision for the country, with the accession to power of Mr. Ramaphosa, who is definitely a man, he's got his faults, but he is definitely a man more in the mold of Nelson Mandela, with the vision and commitment of Nelson Mandela to genuine democracy, to tackling corruption in South Africa. Tied to this, we have the accession to power of President Hichilema in Zambia, which has given great heart to us. He achieved this against all odds, against a brutal leader in Lunga who manipulated the electoral process. And but these are just two countries and two men. And unfortunately, although they are a significant minority in Southern Africa, they are a minority. Tragically, in recent years, Botswana has started to slip down on the democratic scale. And so we've got two countries pretty much against the rest of the countries in Southern Africa. And that accentuates the importance of Zimbabwe, particularly what happens in Zimbabwe in the next couple of years. If Nelson Chamisa and the Triple C are able to overcome the odds and to defeat Emmerson Mnangagwa, it is going to set not only Zimbabwe on a new path, a new democratic path, a new transparent, accountable path, but it is also going to reinforce people like President Ramaphosa and President Hichilema. In fact, I believe that if Zimbabwe changes, we could see a dramatic change throughout Southern Africa, with democracy becoming more entrenched and much higher levels of governance expected right across the region. And to that extent, Zimbabwe is critically important. But let me end with your final question. Why is this important to the West? Well, I'd answer that in a number of ways. First of all, we know that Africa presents a problem to Europe, a problem in the sense that daily in Britain, you have got people trying to cross the English Channel as refugees seeking asylum in Britain. And that is a problem that afflicts the whole of Europe at present. If you look at the British policy at present, where they intend sending people back to Rwanda, that is an admission that Britain has a problem. And it's not just Britain's problem, it's Italy and Spain and Germany. And this problem will not go away simply by tightening up your borders or sending people back to Rwanda. It will only be addressed if young people, particularly throughout Africa, have hope in remaining in Africa, if they have a decent education, if they have the opportunity to get a decent job and build a home and raise a family. And it is a massive problem. It's way beyond you and me, Craig. This is a generational problem, but it has to start somewhere. And if one looks at Africa, you can divide Africa into four broad areas: North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. And the reality is that Southern Africa, of all of those four areas, has the greatest chance of stabilizing, of embracing market economies, of embracing democracy, of keeping its people within Southern Africa. Indeed, in drawing other Africans and other people from other parts of the world into Southern Africa. If Southern Africa doesn't work, what chance does West Africa or East Africa have with all the turmoil in those countries, never mind North Africa? And to that extent, it is critically important that more attention be paid to Southern Africa and to the corrosive effect that Zimbabwe is having on Southern Africa. But let me end with one more international issue. And I want to draw in what is happening in Ukraine at present. Western policy has been to appease President Putin for many years. The West turned a blind eye to Putin's invasion of Crimea in 2014. The Germans thought that they could entice him by entering into business relationships with him, by importing their gas from Russia. look at the problems that have been created by that policy of appeasement. We face the same issue in Southern Africa. The history, in particular, of Zimbabwe is marked by Britain and other nations turning a blind eye to crimes against humanity. And all it has done is exacerbate the situation in this country. It has indirectly resulted in millions, and I underscore that figure, millions of Zimbabweans seeking political and economic asylum elsewhere in the world. It has also resulted in Britain still to this day having to pour in developmental aid to keep our education system and our health system going. That lesson needs to be learned. Whilst Zimbabwe poses no threat because we don't have nuclear weapons, no threat compared to the threat that Russia poses, we are going to continue to be a drain on Western taxpayers unless democracy comes to our nation, unless we become self-supporting. And so purely for self-interest, it is time that Western nations took this more seriously, so that not only will people want to remain in Africa and not become refugees crossing the channel, but that Britain's development budget can be cut and perhaps allocated to other areas. But as things stand at present, those needs will continue.
Yeah, no, thank you, David. And I kind of want to apologize for the crudity of the question, because the other thing I want to say as an African is, I realized this with apartheid. It wasn't just that there was such terrible stuff going on, but the policies meant that we missed out on the richness of South African culture and all that Southern Africa has to bring to the global table. So there's just so many good reasons why the West should want Africa to flourish. But of course, self-interest is not a bad one to appeal to, So David, our time for the interview is more or less up. But I just wanted to, and of course we can pick things up in Q&A. And can I remind people to put your questions in the chat box? We will break, but after the break, we'll need those questions. Otherwise, David and I are very happy to keep talking to one another. But so David, one thing I did want to ask you was, so you became a Christian when you were at the University of Cape Town, and I know some of the people who were involved in that, which is extraordinary to me. And I just wanted to ask you, when you became a Christian, did you immediately see the connection between Christ and social justice, or did it take time for that to develop? As with me, it took me, years to realize the gospel says no to the racism of apartheid. And then the second and the most important question, perhaps, is, the world, America sucks a lot of the oxygen out of the air. We are just in agony over Ukraine at the moment. But do you have a list of practical things that the Kirby Laing Centre and other organizations can do today to help Zimbabwe?
Okay, so to answer your question, I became a Christian in my 4th year at law school. I had been, prior to becoming a Christian, I was heavily involved in leadership of the student body, in human rights issues in apartheid South Africa. I had been the leader of a legal aid clinic in the high-density suburbs of Cape Town, and came face to face with the trauma caused to poor people by the apartheid system. And all of that happened prior to me becoming a Christian. But what becoming a Christian did, and incidentally, I came to faith through studying the book of Romans.
Oh, okay.
And the book of Romans for a lawyer is it's a pivotal book, because it explains in graphic detail why starting off in Romans 1, why the world is in the state it is. And it immediately gave me a framework in which to understand the world much better. And of course, the Bible is the most important document when it comes to setting out what real human rights are and the value of individual humans, irrespective of their race or background. And so I found immediately the book, the Bible to be inspiring. And of course, Jesus himself, because of his concern for underprivileged people and for the marginalized in society, Jesus immediately became not only my savior, but my guide when it came to issues like this. And ever since that, then it has been the foundation for me and the framework in which I try to live my own life.
Mm.
Turning to the Kirby Laing Centre, I'm not sure that I fully understood your question. Would you like to just put it to me again?
Yeah. So, David, I remember during apartheid, a lot of white South Africans would say, we know it's not a good system, but it's better than, an alternative system. There's nothing we can do to change it. And then the National Initiative for Reconciliation, under Michael Cassidy's leadership, produced a document, 15 things you can do today to change the situation. So, what I would like us, and if you like, what we can do is break now for coffee, and then maybe you could start our Q&A with, I want to know, not just Kirby Laing Centre, but all of us, what can we do practically to help the situation in Zimbabwe?
Thank you.
Is that okay? Okay, if we were in a public arena, we'd all be cheering and hollering and clapping, and because David, this has just been truly astounding. I mean, your courage never ceases to amaze me. And when I email David and he tells me he's full of hope, even amidst all the darkness, I think, why am I not always full of hope here in the UK? But thank you so much. And it's now, we will reconvene at 1:45. Okay, so we will take a break now and reconvene. Please come back at 1:45. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Okay, so David, so Jenny Taylor very helpfully alerted us to the fact that the new political organization, CCC, does have a Facebook page. So that is something that all of us can connect with. But do you have other suggestions about things we can do to help?
I've got a variety of suggestions. I think, first of all, what you're doing this evening is wonderful. And you can supplement that by getting to know a bit more about what's going on in Zimbabwe. I think part of the problem that we face is that the West is distracted now. It's been terribly distracted over the last few years by Donald Trump, by COVID, and of course now by Ukraine. And I need to stress, Craig, I understand that the tragedy that's unfolding in Ukraine is nothing. It is terribly important and must be the world's focus. But it does serve the interests of Mnangagwa and the tyrants in Zimbabwe and elsewhere. And the reason it serves them is because the West is now distracted. And it takes Christian organizations in particular to be salt and light, to go against the flow, to educate itself about what is going on, not just in Zimbabwe, but in other tyrannies elsewhere in the world, and to speak out from a position of knowledge. So the first thing I would say is do whatever you can as individuals, as an organization, to keep abreast of what's going on in Zimbabwe. And one doesn't need to just follow the CCC's Facebook page. Those of you who are on Twitter can follow certain Twitter handles which regularly update what's going on and provide very accurate contemporary information about what's going on in Zimbabwe. So that's number one. Keep yourselves educated about Zimbabwe. Secondly, please pray. I'm a great believer in prayer. Please pray specifically. Please pray for Nelson Chamisa. Let me speak briefly about Nelson Chamisa. He is a lawyer like myself, age 44. He has a wonderful wife. He has very bright children. But most importantly, he is a man of deep faith. He is a committed Christian. I play an unstated role in sharing with him constantly, and I share with him Christian articles and the like, and I find him incredibly receptive to them. And if you look, for example, if you follow his Twitter handle, you will see that he regularly acknowledges the sovereignty of God, God's standards of justice, and his policy formulation is entirely based on his Christian faith. So please be specific. Pray for him. Pray for other Christian leaders, not just political leaders in the country. Pray for the church in Zimbabwe. Tragically, the church in Zimbabwe has in the last 40 to 50 years often failed. The white minority church did not speak out against racial discrimination in Rhodesia as it should have. And tragically, in the last 42 years, many church leaders fear man rather than God in our country. Zimbabwe is a religious country, but a country often with very shallow faith. And so pray for the church in Zimbabwe. My constant prayer is to pray that Christian leaders would be raised up within the church, non-political Christian leaders, who would be bold, who would fear God more than man and speak out the gospel in its fullness. Then thirdly, beyond acquainting yourself, beyond prayer, please do what you can. I'm a great believer in the parable of the mustard seed and in those principles, to use them again, of salt and light. The Lord uses weak people to achieve his goals. That's been the experience of my life. And I know it's what the cross is all about. The cross is about, in human terms, weakness, a man dying on a cross, and that's the end. But through that weakness, the Lord achieves his purposes. And so I believe that everyone listening tonight has a role to play. And you can play it, for example, by writing to your MP and asking your MP what they are doing about the Zimbabwean situation at every opportunity, raising it so that we don't lose sight of Zimbabwe in the run-up to these critically important elections next year. I meet diplomats regularly, and my greatest fear about the elections next year is that everyone will be so distracted by Ukraine that governments will pay no attention to what's going on in Zimbabwe. And one of the ways we can counteract that is by individuals within Britain making your own respective MPs holding them to account. Just to close off on this, you may have seen just a couple of weeks ago, there was a very productive debate in the House of Lords on Zimbabwe. That debate hasn't found its way to the lower chamber, but it should. I know it's very difficult in the context of Ukraine and in the context of inflation in Britain and the rising cost of living to get this to get attention paid to Zimbabwe. But I come back to this very important point that the Lord uses the weak and the small things to achieve great things. And so don't be deterred.
Mm. Thank you, David. That's really, really helpful. And when are the Zimbabwe elections next year?
The elections are scheduled for July next year, July 2023. So we're not a long way off them.
No. Okay, so we can plan, to do what we can.